Hey there, welcome back. Go ahead and dim your lights, maybe pour a little something warm, tea, cocoa, questionable medieval ale, whatever helps you relax. Tonight, we're heading somewhere deeply uncomfortable, but in the quietest possible way. A soft little stroll through humanity's least relaxing hobby, punishment. Specifically, the medieval punishments worse than death. Because if there's one thing the Middle Ages did not believe in, it was subtlety. Now, don't worry, this isn't going to be one of those overly graphic true crime rants. No screaming, no sudden plot twists. We're not here to traumatize anyone. We're here to wander slowly, almost gently, through the strange imagination of a civilization that thought pain could purify the soul. And if that doesn't sound like a good bedtime story, well, maybe you've never tried falling asleep to the sound of absurd historical logic. So let's start somewhere safe. Picture this: a medieval town at dusk. The sky is orange with chimney smoke, and the streets are all mud and gossip. There's a wooden post in the center of the square, the kind of thing that doesn't get cleaned very often, and tied to it, some poor soul who apparently couldn't mind their own business. The townsfolk are gathering because of course they are. Punishments were the closest thing to live entertainment in an era before Wi-Fi or, human rights. And while they wait for the local magistrate to appear, people chat casually about the weather, the price of bread, and whether this week's condemned criminal actually deserves it. Spoiler, they usually don't. But justice back then wasn't really about fairness. It was about theater. See, in the medieval mind, sin wasn't just personal. It was contagious, like a social disease that could infect an entire town if left untreated. So, punishments had to be visible, loud, symbolic, something the crowd could see, smell, and probably regret later at dinner. Let's start with the easy ones, the humiliations. The Middle Ages loved public shaming almost as much as they loved bad hygiene. The pillory, for instance, was practically furniture. You've seen it, wooden boards with holes for your head and hands. The condemned would stand there for hours, sometimes days, while people threw anything that wasn't nailed down. Rotten vegetables, mud, insults, moral superiority. And honestly, the psychological damage probably lasted longer than the bruises. Because medieval people didn't just punish your body, they punished your name. You could survive the pillory, but you'd never live it down. The town would remember. The children would point. And in an age where reputation meant survival, that was almost as bad as execution. Then there was the ducking stool, which sounds whimsical until you realize it wasn't. It was mostly used on women, for gossiping, for arguing, for existing too loudly. They'd strap you into a chair on the end of a long wooden beam and dunk you into a river repeatedly until you confessed to whatever nonsense they accused you of. It wasn't designed to kill you, though sometimes it did. The goal was repentance through discomfort, because apparently, cold water could wash away sin and your will to live. Still, some records say women came out of it laughing, defiant, even cursing the men who'd sentenced them, which just made the crowd angrier. Medieval logic was simple. If you're miserable, you're guilty. If you're calm, you're a witch. And witches, of course, had their own special menu of punishments. But we'll float toward that later. Now, the interesting thing about these humiliations is that they weren't considered cruel. Not really. They were seen as educational, like public service announcements, except instead of catchy slogans, you got permanent trauma. The goal was deterrence, making an example so visible that others would behave. It's the same principle as speed cameras today, just with more turnips. But sometimes shame wasn't enough. Sometimes the authorities wanted the lesson to last a bit longer. And that's when they got creative. Let's glide gently into one of the most popular, merciful punishments. Branding. Imagine being caught stealing a loaf of bread. The punishment? A hot iron pressed to your skin, usually on the forehead, sometimes the hand. The mark told everyone what you'd done. AT for thief, an F for forger, an H for heretic. It was the medieval version of a criminal record, except it couldn't be erased. To be fair, some towns offered redemption. If you lived long enough and proved your virtue, you might have the scar blessed by a priest, as if divine bureaucracy could update your status. But the mark stayed. Always. Branding wasn't about pain. It was about ownership. The state was claiming your body the same way a farmer branded his cattle. You were proof of the system's control. A walking billboard for obedience. Still awake? Good, because we're about to move into darker territory. You see, most medieval punishments were designed with one specific fear in mind: chaos. The world was unpredictable. Disease came without warning. Kings died in bed surrounded by priests muttering Latin, and the average person didn't have much say in anything. Punishment, in a way, was one of the few constants. Something reliable. Something you could point to and say, at least that's still working. But the more frightened society became, the harsher the laws grew. Fear breeds cruelty, and the Middle Ages were very, very afraid. Take mutilation, for example. It wasn't as rare as you might think. Losing a hand for theft was common. Losing an ear or nose for slander, also common. It sounds barbaric now, but back then, it was considered merciful. After all, you got to live. Living with half a face was, in their eyes, better than not living at all. Sometimes, judges even used disfigurement as social engineering. A liar might have his tongue pierced. A soldier who fled battle could be branded with a coward's mark. It was justice as performance art, and the audience never got bored. The symbolism ran deep. In their minds, the body was a reflection of the soul. If your hand stole, then the hand was corrupt, and cutting it off purified the rest of you. Logical, in a deeply disturbing way. But even mutilation had its limits. There were crimes too severe or too political for simple disfigurement. And that's when things got inventive. One of the earliest recorded examples of creative execution comes from the year 872. A man boiled alive for forgery. Yes, forgery. Apparently, medieval kings took their signatures very seriously. It became a recurring theme, punishments tailored to the crime. Poisoners were boiled, counterfeiters were melted, arsonists were burned. Justice was a kind of medieval improv, cruel, but thematically consistent. And yet, underneath all that horror, there's something oddly tragic. They weren't monsters, these people. They were trying, clumsily, violently, to make sense of a world they didn't understand. Disease, famine, sin, it all had to mean something. And if suffering was everywhere, then surely suffering was sacred. That's the mindset that turned punishment into ritual. Every iron, every rope, every wheel was a sermon in metal. The message was clear. Sin hurts, obedience saves, and the only safe way through life was submission. Of course, it also helped that the people writing the rules were the ones least likely to face them. Funny how that works. But we're just getting started. There's so much worse waiting just around the corner. Punishments so elaborate they blurred the line between religion and theater. So, stay where you are. Don't move. Let the torches burn a little lower. In part 2, we'll start meeting the truly famous tortures. The ones designed not to kill you, but to keep you alive just long enough to understand what being alive really meant in the Middle Ages. Get comfortable. This is going to get historically uncomfortable. The medieval world treated justice like a kind of public theater. Every punishment was a performance, every execution a sermon in flesh. The square was the stage, the crowd the congregation, and the condemned the unwilling actor whose body carried the moral of the story. It was less about what a person had done, and more about what they could be made to represent. In an age before literacy, law had to be visible. Words could be twisted, but pain could not. A man hanging from the gallows, a woman ducked into a pond, a thief missing a hand. These were lessons anyone could understand. Punishment wasn't meant to reform. It was meant to warn, to remind everyone watching that sin had weight, and that the world, however chaotic, still had consequences. The most dreaded punishments were reserved for crimes that struck at the social order: treason, heresy, betrayal. Ordinary crimes like theft or brawling could be punished with fines, whippings, or the pillory. But to betray your king or your faith was to betray the foundation of existence itself. That's when justice turned ceremonial, almost religious in its cruelty. Among the most symbolic of these punishments was flaying, the deliberate removal of the skin. It sounds too horrific to comprehend now, but to medieval minds it was loaded with meaning. Skin represented loyalty and integrity. To peel it away was to reveal the deceit that lay beneath. The act wasn't just about pain, it was about revelation. The sinner, stripped of his outer layer, was literally laid bare before God. The chroniclers recorded it with chilling detachment. They wrote that traitors were made an example for others to behold and fear. The spectacle of it mattered more than the act itself. The executioner wasn't just a killer. He was a craftsman of divine justice, turning punishment into prophecy. Each flaying was a performance in the eternal drama between order and chaos. Another favorite of the medieval imagination was the wheel, known simply and grimly as breaking. The condemned was tied to a large wooden cartwheel. Then, methodically, their limbs were smashed with an iron club. The bones shattered, but the body remained alive long enough to serve its symbolic purpose. When the execution was done, the wheel was hoisted upright, displaying the broken form for all to see. The body twisted among the spokes became a living diagram of divine punishment. Sin fragmented, disobedience broken back into obedience. To the people who gathered to watch, this wasn't barbarism. It was order made visible. In their minds, the pain was proof that the universe still worked, that evil had a price, and that someone, whether God or king, was keeping score. They didn't cheer because they were cruel. They cheered because they were terrified, and fear loves ritual. The wheel, however, was only one of many inventions in Europe's long obsession with poetic justice. The logic of medieval punishment always tried to fit the crime. Arsonists were burned. Poisoners were boiled. Counterfeiters were melted like the false coins they had forged. The idea was symmetry. What you did to the world would do to you. It was justice by mirror, moral geometry written in fire and iron. Boiling as punishment became formal law under Henry VIII in 1531. The king decided that hanging was too kind for poisoners, whose crimes were secret, invisible, and therefore especially vile. So he decreed that they should die publicly, in boiling water, oil, or wine. It wasn't improvisation. It was regulation, written in the legal codes of the day. The chroniclers described it as if announcing a new tax. Justice, it seemed, was best served hot. Less lethal, but no less terrifying, was blinding. It was a punishment reserved for nobles and rebels, men who could not simply be executed because of their status, but who had to be broken symbolically. Blinding stripped a man of his power to command, to write, to rule. It left him alive but useless, a living warning to others who might dream of rebellion. Some were left to wander monasteries, guided by servants or children, reciting prayers for forgiveness they'd never receive. Their silence became part of the kingdom's stability. And for those who weren't noble enough to earn such mercy, mutilation was the next best thing. Thieves lost fingers, liars lost tongues, adulterers lost noses. It was brutal, yes, but also bureaucratic. The wounds were paperwork carved in flesh. The body was the record, and no one could forge it. You could escape prison, but you couldn't escape your own face. The crowd rarely protested these punishments. They came, they watched, they went home. Markets were set up near gallows. Vendors sold bread and ale. Parents brought their children. It was both civic duty and entertainment, morality and spectacle. For many, it was the only time they saw the state up close. The king was a rumor. The executioner was real. But for all the horror, there was an odd kind of comfort in it. The medieval world was full of uncertainty. Famine, plague, war, sudden death. Injustice was everywhere. Seeing justice enacted, even violently, made the world feel less random. Someone somewhere was keeping balance. The broken body on the wheel was proof that the universe still had rules. Not every punishment ended in death. Some were designed to stretch suffering into silence. Imprisonment, though rare, was one such fate. Medieval prisons weren't meant to rehabilitate, they were waiting rooms for despair. The cells were damp, airless, and dark. The condemned might spend years there, forgotten by everyone, slowly dissolving into the stones. The authorities didn't have to kill you if hopelessness did the job for them. Religious orders had their own versions of this. Monks who broke their vows could be locked away in solitary cells for months, given only bread, water, and a candle for prayer. The goal was purification through deprivation. To purge sin, one had to sit with it until it consumed the self. Some never came out. Others emerged half saint, half ghost, living testaments to divine correction. And then there was banishment, the softest and yet cruelest punishment of all. To be exiled meant losing everything that made you human in the eyes of society. Your name, your work, your family, your place in the world. A medieval person without a community was nothing. Alone, they couldn't trade, couldn't marry, couldn't pray in public. They existed, but barely. Many exiles didn't survive a year. The wilderness outside the town's walls was a graveyard for the forgotten. Yet even here, in the cracks of cruelty, small mercies glimmered. Executioners sometimes gave quick deaths, disguising it as skill. Priests whispered absolution into condemned ears. Crowds occasionally rebelled against the spectacle, shouting mercy instead of blood. Humanity wasn't gone. It was just hiding, buried beneath fear and ritual. The strange thing about medieval justice is how consistent it was. Cruelty had logic. Suffering had purpose. No one saw it as evil. They saw it as necessary maintenance of the world's moral machinery. They believed that without punishment, sin would multiply until society collapsed. And so, they punished not with malice but with conviction. And conviction, history has shown, is far more dangerous than hatred. In the next part, the punishments turn spiritual, acts meant to cleanse the soul rather than destroy the body. We'll explore what happened when faith and fear joined hands, and pain became a form of prayer. By the height of the Middle Ages, punishment and religion had become so tightly woven together that you could hardly tell where one ended and the other began. Every courtroom was a chapel in miniature. Every act of judgment carried the weight of eternity. Sin was not only a violation of law, it was an infection of the soul, and only deliberate suffering could draw it out. People believed pain had a purpose, an alchemy that turned guilt into grace. That idea produced the strangest forms of justice imaginable. A thief could repay his crime by public whipping, not because it reimbursed the victim, but because it satisfied heaven. A heretic could atone for false belief by walking barefoot to Rome. A woman accused of adultery might fast for 40 days, while her husband was expected to forgive her publicly, proving that divine order had been restored. To the medieval mind, the universe itself was moral. You didn't just break laws, you disturbed creation. Punishment, therefore, wasn't cruelty. It was cosmic housekeeping. The Church perfected the art of penitential punishment. Monks and theologians produced endless manuals describing exactly how one should suffer for each sin. There were fasting schedules, prayer counts, pilgrimage distances, all measured like spiritual mathematics. The idea was that through controlled pain or deprivation, The sinner could imitate Christ's passion and therefore cleanse his own transgressions. It was a logical system, but one built entirely on the currency of agony. Within monasteries, this logic took on an especially silent form. When a monk broke his vows, spoke out of turn, touched forbidden food, questioned his superior, he might be sentenced to days of solitary confinement. The cell was small, barely wider than a coffin, with a narrow slit for light. Bread and water were passed through a hatch. Conversation was forbidden. The monk's only companion was his own guilt. The walls sweated, the air smelled of stone and candle wax, and the hours blurred until there was no sense of day or night. Some found enlightenment there. Others found madness. The church called both outcomes success. Outside the cloister, penitence took on grander, more theatrical forms. Public confession became a ritual in itself. Whole towns gathered to watch sinners proclaim their guilt, barefoot and trembling, wearing white robes as symbols of purity regained. Some carried candles. Others wore signs around their necks describing their crimes. The crowd prayed, but they also whispered. Forgiveness was a spectacle like any other. The most famous of these were the flagellants, bands of men and women who roamed Europe during times of plague or famine, whipping themselves in public squares. They believed the world's suffering was caused by human sin, and that only voluntary pain could convince God to relent. For hours they marched through mud and rain, singing hymns between lashes, leaving streaks of blood in their wake. Townspeople watched with a mixture of awe and unease. The church tolerated them for a while. At least they were pious, but eventually condemned the practice as heresy. Too much self-punishment, apparently, was bad for discipline. It's easy to dismiss such extremes as fanaticism, but beneath them lay genuine fear. Medieval people saw disaster everywhere. Disease that killed without warning, harvests that failed overnight, wars that swallowed whole generations. The world seemed constantly on the verge of divine collapse. Suffering, then, was not random. It was communication. If God was angry, someone had to apologize. Pain was how you said sorry. This theology of suffering bled into secular justice too. Civil courts borrowed the church's language. Trials became rituals of confession. Torture became a form of persuasion. If truth was holy, then forcing it from a liar's body was an act of piety. The most common device for this was the strappato, a rope tied to the prisoner's wrists, hoisting him upward until the joints dislocated. It wasn't meant to kill, at least not quickly. The goal was to extract the truth, to cleanse deceit through agony. And because confession was sacred, it didn't even matter if the accused was innocent. The pain itself was proof that the system worked. The irony is that the church actually had rules for mercy. Papal decrees limited torture sessions to 1 per day and forbade drawing blood, which led to endless creative interpretations. Without bloodshed simply meant the wounds couldn't be open. Broken bones were fine. Dislocations were fine. The theology was airtight. For those convicted of heresy, the ultimate punishment was excommunication, a word that sounds almost peaceful until you realize what it meant. To be excommunicated was to be cut off not just from the church, but from existence itself. You could not receive sacraments, could not be buried in consecrated ground, could not even be greeted by the faithful. People crossed themselves when you passed, as though warding off disease. In a world where salvation was everything, it was spiritual extinction. Many begged for death instead. When excommunication failed to bring repentance, the next step was the stake. Burning was reserved for crimes against faith, heresy, witchcraft, blasphemy, sins that threatened eternity itself. Fire, they believed, was purifying, consumed the flesh but freed the soul. Priests attended every execution, urging the condemned to confess in the flames. Some did. Others sang hymns instead. Either way, the crowd watched quietly, believing they were witnessing both justice and salvation. To modernize, it's difficult to see mercy in any of this, but to them, mercy was precisely the point. Death without repentance was damnation. Suffering with repentance was grace. The executioner was not a monster but a midwife, delivering the sinner's soul back to God through the birth canal of agony. That was the logic. Cold, consistent, terrible. Not every heretic burned. Some were imprisoned for life, their mouths gagged to prevent blasphemy. Others were forced to wear symbols of shame: yellow crosses, shaved heads, distinctive robes. Punishment continued long after the sentence ended, echoing in the way people looked at them, in the silence that followed them through the streets. Shame was the slowest fire of all. And yet, even in these depths, there were small gestures of rebellion. Some condemned prisoners laughed as the flames were lit, denying the church its satisfaction. Some towns quietly prayed for the heretic after the executioner's work was done. One chronicler records a boy who ran forward to throw a flower into the fire. A small, forbidden act of sympathy that survived longer than the sermon. The Middle Ages were not uniformly cruel. They were complicated. People believed in justice, but they also believed in pity. It was just difficult to know when one ended and the other began. As Europe crept toward the Renaissance, doubts began to flicker. Scholars started to wonder whether pain really proved innocence. Jurists began to question whether public spectacle cured sin or merely entertained it. A few even suggested that justice might be more effective if it were quiet, private, less theatrical. It would take centuries for those whispers to become law, but the seed was planted. Before that transformation, though, came one more phase: the punishments of honor and reputation. These didn't scar the body or kill the soul. They wounded something subtler: dignity. Because for medieval people, shame could be sharper than any blade. By the late Middle Ages, when Europe was halfway between superstition and reason, punishment had begun to shift. The sword and flame still held power, but something quieter had crept into the system: a fascination with humiliation. Physical pain was visible, dramatic, but shame lingered. It followed a person through streets, through conversations, through generations. If death ended the story, humiliation rewrote it forever. To be shamed was to be socially amputated. Medieval people lived in tight, closed communities where reputation meant survival. A ruined name could starve you as surely as hunger. Merchants refused to trade with you. Neighbors refused to greet you. Even the parish priest might glance away when offering communion. The church called it correction through dishonor. But in truth, it was social death, a slower, cleaner, more enduring kind. The stage for such punishments was always the public square. Here, the authorities blurred the line between justice and spectacle. The crowd was both jury and accomplice, their eyes the instruments of execution. The condemned was forced into view, stripped of symbols, dignity, and occasionally clothing. The goal wasn't to hurt, but to display. A thief might wear a sign reading his crime. An adulterer might be paraded with horns on his head. A slanderer might have her tongue clamped between wooden tongs. The punishment had to fit the offense, and the more creative the symbolism, the more satisfied the magistrates seemed to be. The pillory was the most familiar of these devices. It stood in the busiest corner of the town square, a wooden frame with holes for the neck and hands. Once locked in, you were immobilized, neither sitting nor standing, unable to scratch, swat, or even blink comfortably. And then the crowd took over. They shouted, jeered, threw refuse, sometimes recited prayers as if exorcising the sinner's soul. The victim endured not just the assault but the gaze, the unbearable scrutiny of 100 faces enjoying moral superiority. When it was over, the damage wasn't measured in bruises but in glances that would follow forever after. The stocks were a cousin of the pillory, used for lesser crimes, public drunkenness, petty theft, or simply irritating the wrong official. People sat with their feet locked in place, unable to stand or move, sometimes overnight. Passing children played games, dangling objects just out of reach, or smearing honey on the prisoners' faces to attract flies. The humiliation was communal fun, a participatory morality play where everyone got to contribute a little cruelty. In villages where water was plentiful, the ducking stool performed a similar function. Suspended over a river or pond, it turned punishment into slapstick theology. The condemned, most often women accused of gossiping or witchcraft, was strapped into a chair attached to a long beam. The crowd counted aloud as she was lowered into the water. 1, 2, 3, and raised again, gasping and dripping. The more she struggled, the guiltier she appeared. There was no winning. If she cursed, she confirmed her wickedness. If she prayed, it was mockery. By the time she was released, soaked and shivering, her spirit had been thoroughly washed, if not cleansed. Humiliation also extended to the body itself. Branding, for example, combined pain and shame into one efficient act. A heated iron pressed to the skin left an unmistakable mark. T for thief, F for forger, M for murderer. In a world without documents, it was the most permanent identification possible. You could flee a town, but not your own flesh. And while some marks faded over time, others became infected, leaving scars that made the punishment self-perpetuating. The criminal became a walking announcement of their own failure. Among nobles, whose bodies were considered too precious for branding or the pillory, humiliation took subtler forms. A knight convicted of cowardice might be forced to wear his armor backward during a public procession. A lord who broke his oath could be made to stand barefoot before his peers, sword reversed, head bowed, until the king forgave him or didn't. Even in palaces, shame was ceremony. Rank didn't protect you from ridicule. It only made the audience richer. The church, naturally, contributed its own version, penitential parades. These processions blurred the boundary between religion and punishment. The sinner, dressed in plain linen and often carrying a candle, would walk through town while the congregation sang prayers for his soul. It was meant to be redemptive, but it also provided excellent entertainment. People speculated about what the offender had done, debated whether his tears were sincere, and measured the quality of his remorse like judges at a tournament. Forgiveness, it seemed, required choreography. There was also a specialized ritual for blasphemers, those who spoke irreverently of God or the saints. In France, they were forced to march barefoot, holding a torch, while priests sprinkled them with holy water and the crowd murmured half-hearted amens. Their tongues were sometimes pierced with hot irons or clamped between boards, a warning against future eloquence. It was theology by dental surgery. Even the dead were not spared shame. Excommunication could follow a person beyond the grave. Corpses of heretics or traitors were occasionally exhumed, dragged through the streets, and reburied in unconsecrated ground. The message was clear. Not even death canceled your debts. In a society obsessed with salvation, that was the ultimate disgrace. Your bones themselves were denied belonging. It's strange, perhaps, that such an age, so convinced of divine order, found its greatest pleasure in disordering others. Yet that contradiction ran through every level of society. The church preached humility while staging public penance. Kings spoke of mercy while commissioning new scaffolds. Townspeople prayed for forgiveness in the morning and jeered at prisoners by noon. Everyone participated. Everyone believed. The system worked precisely because no one saw themselves as cruel. They were defending virtue, preserving harmony, keeping the world safe from chaos. But shame is a slippery thing. Once unleashed, it rarely stays where it's put. Sometimes the crowd turned its gaze back on the accusers. A punishment that went too far could spark sympathy. A wrongfully shamed person could become a folk hero. There are records of towns intervening mid-sentence, pushing through guards to free someone from the pillory, shouting that enough was enough. The authorities called it riot. The people called it justice. Such moments were rare, but they reveal something human beneath the discipline. For all their piety and superstition, medieval people recognized unfairness when they saw it. They just didn't have many words for it yet. The vocabulary of rights, equality, and dignity was centuries away. In their world, mercy had to disguise itself as rebellion. And even in the harshest punishments, there was often a strange intimacy. Executioners spoke softly to their victims, offering small comforts. Some would tighten a rope to make death quicker, or slip a prayer under the prisoner's tongue. They understood what the judges didn't, that the difference between justice and cruelty was sometimes just a few heartbeats. Shame, in the end, proved more durable than any scaffold. The scars it left on faces, on families, on memory, outlasted the Middle Ages themselves. Even as Europe modernized, the logic of humiliation endured. It would resurface in later centuries as public stocks, debtors' prisons, scarlet letters. Civilization, it turned out, was less a clean break from barbarism than a gradual rebranding. For now, imagine the town square again at twilight. The crowd disperses, the torches sputter out. A man steps down from the pillory, eyes downcast, body stiff from hours of stillness. The air smells of smoke and cold bread. Children chase each other through the empty stalls. Tomorrow he will walk the same streets, and people will pretend not to notice him. The punishment is over, but it isn't. That's the secret of medieval justice. It never really ended. It just followed you home. By the 14th century, punishment had become less a sacred ritual and more a weekly event. It was woven into the rhythm of civic life. Market days, festivals, trials, executions. The gallows stood permanently at the edge of towns, tall enough to be seen from every street. They were landmarks as familiar as church towers. Children grew up under their shadow, learning morality by osmosis. Executions drew enormous crowds. Merchants set up stalls selling bread, ale, and small trinkets carved in the shape of the instruments about to be used. Minstrels sang ballads about famous criminals while pickpockets worked the crowd. The irony was lost on no one. It was commerce, theater, and piety rolled into one. Town officials even published notices announcing the exact hour of hanging, so people could plan the day around it. At the center of this choreography stood the executioner, a strange and lonely figure. In theory, he was a servant of justice, chosen for his strength and precision. In practice, he was half celebrity, half outcast. People depended on him yet refused to touch him. He lived on the edge of town, married among his own, and passed his profession from father to son. Chroniclers note that many executioners were surprisingly gentle, proud of their efficiency, conscious of their role as the final act in a long moral drama. They learned to read expressions, to time the drop of a rope, to give a clean cut when the law demanded spectacle but not suffering. Their skill was measured by speed and composure. A hesitant swing could ruin a career. A botched hanging might start a riot. Some carried small knives to finish the job discreetly if things went wrong. Afterward, they cleaned the scaffold themselves. They had to. No one else would touch it. For the condemned, this spectacle offered an odd kind of stage. They were expected to perform repentance, to give a final speech, to demonstrate that the system worked. The ideal criminal died with grace, confessing, forgiving, accepting fate. Those who cursed or refused were seen as villains twice over, guilty of both crime and pride. It was redemption by choreography once again. You suffered publicly, and the crowd left convinced that justice had balance. As cities grew, punishments multiplied to match the complexity of society. Prisons expanded from temporary holding cells into long-term institutions. The goal was still control, but now it was bureaucratic control, endless ledgers, fines, and decrees. The philosophy was shifting. Where once the church had ruled through sin and penance, civic authorities ruled through paperwork. Both systems relied on obedience, just different vocabularies. Still, old habits lingered. Public whippings continued in market squares, sometimes accompanied by drummers to mark the rhythm of the blows. Branding irons were standardized, each region with its own shapes and letters. Records survive listing exactly how much each punishment cost. The rope, the wood for the scaffold, the executioner's fee, the refreshments for the officials. Pain had become an itemized expense. It's easy to imagine this world as alien, but its motives were familiar. People wanted order. They feared chaos. They wanted to see their rulers act, even if those actions were cruel. A hanging was a civic reassurance. Proof that someone, somewhere, was keeping the darkness at bay. The crowd might shudder, but they went home calmer. There were critics, though. In the late 15th century, a few writers began to question the wisdom of public cruelty. Philosophers hinted that punishment should reform, not just terrify. Some priests worried that the crowd's laughter during executions offended God. There are accounts of preachers shouting sermons over jeering spectators, begging them to show pity. It rarely worked. The crowd was addicted. Justice had become entertainment. Foreign travelers often wrote about these spectacles with morbid fascination. One Venetian visitor to Paris described a beheading as a most pious affair, attended by fine citizens and excellent music. Another in England noted that the execution was delayed so a local lord could arrive in time to watch. Even the condemned occasionally joined in the theatrics. Some dressed elegantly, delivered eloquent farewells, or tipped the executioner for a swift blow. The line between tragedy and pageant blurred completely. Beneath the noise, something else was happening. The very excess of spectacle began to dull its power. When people saw too many punishments, the moral message faded. Suffering lost its edge. Chroniclers complained that the crowds grew restless, talking through executions, leaving early if the entertainment was poor. The state's great theater of fear was starting to bore its audience. That fatigue marked the beginning of a quiet revolution. Slowly, the display moved indoors. Trials became more formal, less public. Executions, once grand ceremonies, turned into early morning affairs behind walls. The church, too, began to soften. Confession replaced flagellation. Penance became prayer rather than performance. Society was learning, haltingly, that fear was an unreliable teacher. Yet, even as the scaffold's power waned, its memory persisted. Artists painted scenes of justice as moral allegories. Blindfolded figures, balanced scales, swords raised high. Playwrights and poets turned execution into metaphor. Pain remained central to the imagination, only now it was symbolic, aesthetic, a drama of conscience rather than flesh. What hadn't changed was the belief that punishment had to be seen. Whether in the square or in a painting, justice demanded witnesses. The medieval mind could not conceive of private retribution. A crime hidden in darkness had to be answered with light, no matter how harsh. Even mercy had to be visible to count. By the dawn of the Renaissance, Europe stood on the edge of contradiction. It spoke the language of humanism but still clung to its gallows. The same cities that built cathedrals of beauty also maintained torture chambers in their basements. Kings commissioned philosophers to write about virtue while hiring executioners to display it. Civilization, it seemed, had learned to smile while holding the whip. In this new era, punishment would slowly evolve again, from physical pain to psychological pressure, from spectacle to system. But that transformation was centuries away. For now, the scaffold still stood, the crowd still gathered, and the echo of drums still rolled through cobbled streets. The Middle Ages were ending, but the show was not. By the 15th century, Europe had begun whispering the word reason with something close to reverence. Universities multiplied, printing presses scattered books like seeds, and people started to imagine that knowledge could cure ignorance. In theory, this new confidence should have softened the old cruelties. But progress rarely moves in straight lines. The Renaissance brought art and anatomy, philosophy and plague, and an appetite for order that looked suspiciously medieval once you stepped close enough to smell it. The gallows were still there, cleaned, repaired, freshly oiled. The pillories still stood at market corners, though they now competed with street preachers and merchants selling translations of Cicero. Executions, once called acts of faith, were now called acts of state. The words changed, the ropes did not. The difference was tone. Where the medieval judge had spoken of God's wrath, the Renaissance magistrate spoke of social harmony. The reasoning was secular now, but the logic identical. One must suffer so the many may feel safe. Justice had discovered rational vocabulary but kept its appetite for drama. In Italy, city-states like Florence and Venice turned punishment into pageantry. Processions of the condemned wound through marble streets, flanked by soldiers and clerks. Artists sketched the scenes from windows, fascinated by posture and expression. Chroniclers described the color of the morning light, the fluttering banners, the dignity of death delivered with civic efficiency. It was morality rendered picturesque. Even the architecture changed. Cities began building permanent scaffolds of brick and stone, designed to blend with public squares. They were monuments to order, as carefully proportioned as cathedrals. Some were engraved with Latin maxims, "Let justice reign," "The law stands eternal," phrases that sounded noble when chiseled into limestone but rang hollow when read beside a dangling body. Torture, too, acquired new polish. The Renaissance mind loved precision, and that included the mechanics of confession. Manuals for magistrates outlined procedures in exquisite detail. How long to suspend a man by the wrists, how many turns of the rack counted as moderate pressure, how to question a suspect without compromising one's dignity. It was cruelty with clean fingernails, justified by philosophy instead of faith. One Venetian document from 1580 describes a courtroom where musicians played quietly to calm the nerves of the accused. The same report ends with a note that the prisoner confessed after customary persuasion. The civility almost outshines the barbarity, and perhaps that was the point. The age of manners had arrived, but beneath the silk doublets, the heart still beat medieval. Meanwhile, the Church, uneasy at losing its monopoly on morality, redoubled its emphasis on penance. Pilgrimages flourished again, not as desperate wanderings this time, but as structured journeys of rehabilitation. Criminals sentenced to long walks across Europe wore iron collars stamped with crosses, their progress recorded in parish ledgers. Every town they passed marked a step toward forgiveness. The act of walking became both punishment and prayer. Endurance turned into evidence of repentance. In France, the theologians of the Sorbonne debated whether mercy could reform sinners more effectively than pain. Some argued that the soul needed gentle correction. Others countered that leniency bred vice. The discussion dragged on for decades, producing elegant Latin and zero practical change. It was the intellectual version of walking in circles, graceful, erudite, but still within the same old walls. The most significant change came not from priests or philosophers but from merchants. Trade demanded stability, and stability required predictability. Merchants wanted laws written, not improvised. They wanted punishments fixed, not theatrical. Slowly, economies began to replace passions. The logic of business crept into justice. Fines instead of floggings, confinement instead of carnage. Pain, though still popular, became expensive. Prisons expanded accordingly. No longer just holding pens, they became instruments of correction, at least in theory. In reality, they were overcrowded, foul, and corrupt. Guards extorted prisoners for better food or blankets. Diseases flourished in the damp air. Yet people began to speak of incarceration as progress, as if replacing public agony with private misery counted as civilization. Writers of the age started to notice the contradiction. Montaigne, in his essays, wondered aloud whether fear truly deterred crime. "When we punish," he wrote, "do we heal the man or merely satisfy ourselves?" It was a dangerous question, one that would echo into later centuries. For now, it was filed politely under philosophy and ignored by the courts. The Renaissance obsession with spectacle lingered, even as it pretended to elevate itself. Paintings of martyrdom filled churches. Engravings of executions sold briskly to curious collectors. The same society that claimed to refine cruelty turned it into art. Viewers gazed at saints in flames, their faces serene, their bodies beautiful. Suffering had become aesthetic, distanced, safe, a commodity. That fascination extended to anatomy theaters, where scholars dissected corpses before audiences of students and nobles. The language of punishment crept in even there. The body opened, examined, displayed for truth. Knowledge replaced judgment, but the posture was the same. The human form remained the stage upon which meaning was carved. In this world of contradictions, small gestures of mercy began to matter enormously. A quick death instead of a slow one, a reduced fine, a pardon granted on a holiday, all signs that the moral temperature was cooling by degrees. Some rulers discovered that leniency, when publicized correctly, inspired as much loyalty as fear. Monarchs began to issue edicts of clemency, often timed with coronations or births, turning mercy into another kind of spectacle. But the transition was far from complete. In the countryside, superstition clung stubbornly to its roots. Witch trials spread like wildfire in regions where famine and disease had left people desperate for explanations. Local magistrates, armed with new legal vocabularies, pursued old terrors. Women, healers, and widows were dragged from their homes, accused of consorting with devils, tortured into confessions, and burned as examples. It was medieval hysteria wrapped in Renaissance rhetoric, evidence that enlightenment had boundaries. By the end of the 16th century, Europe stood divided between its ideals and its instincts. The printing press shouted progress, but the scaffold whispered continuity. Cities lit by humanist thought still glowed with the same fires that had consumed heretics 200 years earlier. The age of reason had dawned, but the light fell unevenly, casting long shadows behind it. And yet, those shadows contained the seeds of change. Each contradiction, a philosopher questioning torture, a merchant demanding stable laws, an artist painting pity instead of glory, pushed the world a little closer to doubt. Doubt, after all, is the beginning of mercy. It would take another 100 years for that mercy to find its language. For now, justice still wore a mask of civility, smiling as it wielded the same old tools. The Renaissance had dressed cruelty in silk, but it hadn't yet learned how to let it go. By the 17th century, fear had become fashionable again. The Renaissance had promised enlightenment, but enlightenment, it turned out, could be exhausting. Printing had spread knowledge. It had also spread panic. Every pamphlet about reason seemed to breed two more about sorcery. The more people learned about the world, the more they realized how little control they had over it. And when the unknown looms large, societies start lighting fires. Those fires were literal. Across Europe, from Scotland to Saxony, people began hunting witches with the same bureaucratic precision they once reserved for tax collection. It was a perfect storm of theology, superstition, and politics. The church and the newly secular states both needed enemies, visible threats that could unite their subjects. Witches served beautifully. They were everywhere and nowhere, guilty by rumor, damned by misfortune. Punishment in this new climate shifted from crime to contamination. The goal was not to correct but to cleanse. Entire towns turned inward, terrified that evil might be living next door or sleeping in the same bed. Justice became hysteria in legal robes. The machinery of these trials was disturbingly organized. Local inquisitors traveled with handbooks explaining how to detect witches, how to interrogate them, and how to interpret their confessions. The most famous, the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, read like a how-to manual for paranoia. It listed signs of witchcraft that included sudden illness, dead livestock, sour milk, or, inconveniently, being an old woman with opinions. The interrogations followed a grimly familiar script. Torture, though technically regulated, was standard. The accused were stripped, shaved, and searched for witch marks, moles, scars, or any blemish that could be declared diabolical. Needles were pressed into the skin to see if the spot bled. If it didn't, proof of guilt. If it did, they simply tried again somewhere else. The law of averages guaranteed conviction. Once a confession was extracted, the rest of the trial was ceremony. Public recantation, parades of penance, and finally the stake. Fire was still the favorite method, both for its symbolism and its convenience. It left no body, no relic, nothing to venerate. The flames purified everything, at least on paper. Towns that burned witches often reported feeling cleansed, as if evil had been physically scrubbed from their streets. The feeling lasted until the next bad harvest. What's striking about these persecutions is their ordinariness. They weren't carried out by fanatics in masks, but by notaries, mayors, and priests, the same people who baptized babies and collected taxes. Their signatures fill the surviving documents, neat and confident, beside the trembling marks of the accused. They believed they were defending their communities, not destroying them. In that way, witch trials were the purest continuation of medieval punishment. Cruelty dressed as duty, pain rebranded as protection. Some executions became almost festive. Witnesses described markets springing up around the pyres, vendors selling sweets and wine while the crowd murmured prayers. Children perched on their fathers' shoulders to see better. The condemned were urged to confess one last time, to die in peace. Those who refused were admired for their defiance and condemned for it in the same breath. Not every region embraced the mania equally. In Italy and Spain, inquisitors were paradoxically more cautious, insisting on paperwork and verification. But in the colder corners of Northern Europe, Scotland, Germany, the Baltic states, the hysteria burned hottest. Small villages executed dozens, sometimes hundreds, within weeks. The numbers blur because the records do. A whole gender became a category of suspicion. And yet, amid the horror, there were early voices of reason. Some scholars noticed that confessions extracted under torture tended to sound remarkably similar, as if scripted. Judges occasionally refused to continue trials, citing lack of evidence. A few bishops even banned witch hunts outright, declaring them superstition. But their protests were whispers against a storm. Fear always shouts louder. For the victims, there was rarely dignity in death, but sometimes there was clarity. Accounts tell of women who, bound to the stake, forgave their accusers aloud. Others cursed them instead, which the crowd took as proof of guilt. Either way, the circle closed neatly. In a world determined to see sin, every word became evidence. These trials blurred the lines between church and state, faith and fear. Governments discovered that moral panic could strengthen their authority. The more people trembled, the more they obeyed. Witch hunts became a tool of social control, a way to vent tension, redirect anger, and remind citizens who defined reality. In that sense, they were the spiritual descendants of the pillory and the wheel, just with a more supernatural script. The Age of Reason wasn't blind to irony. Philosophers wrote about natural law while towns burned their neighbors. Physicians dissected corpses to study disease while confessors blamed demons for the plague. Progress and superstition coexisted like mismatched roommates, arguing in the same candlelit rooms. Europe was learning to question authority but hadn't yet learned how to live without it. Eventually, fatigue set in. After decades of accusations, even the most zealous towns ran out of witches. Trials dwindled, confessions grew predictable, and officials began to notice how much the whole enterprise cost. Enlightenment, when it finally arrived, didn't sweep away the madness. It simply bored it to death. By the early 18th century, laws against witchcraft still existed, but few cared to enforce them. The last executions flickered out quietly, almost apologetically. Europe exhaled, ashamed but unrepentant. The fires had gone out, yet their smoke lingered, thin, invisible, and stubborn. When the dust settled, thinkers began to reinterpret what had happened. Philosophers like Voltaire and Locke cited the witch trials as proof that ignorance bred tyranny. They argued that a rational society must rely on evidence, not fear. Their essays dripped with irony, written by men whose own governments still tortured prisoners behind closed doors. But the seed was planted again. Maybe justice didn't need spectacle. Maybe truth didn't need pain. The witching years left Europe scarred but wiser. They revealed the dark symmetry between faith and doubt, showing how easily a search for purity becomes a license for cruelty. And though the gallows and pyres would fade, the habit of collective outrage would never fully disappear. Societies would simply find new names for witches, traitors, enemies, subversives, and invent modern tools for burning them. The Middle Ages had ended centuries earlier, but in spirit, they were never far away. Fear of disorder, hunger for righteousness, the thrill of seeing someone else suffer for the common good, these survived every reform. They just learned to dress better. The next age would call itself enlightened, and in many ways it was. Yet even as philosophers spoke of liberty and law, prisons multiplied, and new machines promised more humane ways to kill. The dream of painless punishment was born, a contradiction so elegant it could only belong to modernity. By the 18th century, Europe had begun congratulating itself on becoming civilized. You can see this transformation in the architecture of prisons. The dark, filthy dungeons of the Middle Ages gave way to new designs, symmetrical, ventilated, almost beautiful. The most famous was the Panopticon, imagined by the philosopher Jeremy Bentham, a circular building with a single watchtower at the center, from which every cell could be seen but never knew when it was being watched. The design was meant to replace the whip with the gaze. The prisoner would internalize surveillance and behave himself. Punishment would become invisible, continuous, self-sustaining. Bentham called it a triumph of reason. Later generations would call it a prototype for modern anxiety. But the most dramatic emblem of Enlightenment justice appeared in revolutionary France: the guillotine. It was presented as a moral machine, a symbol of equality before the law. Everyone, noble or peasant, would die the same way, swiftly and without suffering. No more botched beheadings, no more drawn-out strangulations. Science had solved pain. At first, the French public adored it. They called it the national razor, a tool of progress. Crowds cheered its precision, journalists praised its fairness, and doctors measured its efficiency with stopwatches. The executioner became an engineer, a technician of justice. The guillotine represented everything the Enlightenment believed about itself: rational, egalitarian, humane. And yet, within a few years, the machine's humanists began to feel disturbingly mechanical. The blade fell too easily, too often. What had begun as an act of mercy turned into an assembly line of death. During the Reign of Terror, it worked from dawn to dusk, claiming thousands in Paris alone. Heads rolled in baskets, citizens applauded, and the revolution devoured itself. Reason, it seemed, had learned how to bite. Elsewhere in Europe, other nations watched in fascination and horror. Some adopted the guillotine. Others refined their own systems of civilized punishment. Hanging became more standardized ropes of measured length, designed to snap the neck quickly. Torture, officially abolished, continued quietly in interrogation rooms under euphemisms like enhanced questioning. Mercy had been mechanized, not moralized. The Enlightenment's obsession with control produced an entire science of punishment. Criminology was born, its scholars measuring skulls, cataloging facial expressions, and inventing early theories of criminal psychology. They believed that evil could be diagnosed like disease, mapped across the bones of the face. Artists drew criminals in profile, noting jawlines and brows as if charting the geography of sin. Behind the elegance of their sketches lurked the same old conviction that suffering, properly managed, could perfect society. Prisons became laboratories for this new social engineering. Inmates were subjected to silence, solitary confinement, and forced labor, not as retribution but as therapy. The logic was that the soul, left alone with itself, would reform. In practice, it produced despair, madness, and suicide. But reformers took those outcomes as evidence that the system worked. A broken will, after all, was a sign of humility restored. Even the language of punishment softened. Where medieval laws had shouted, "Death!" the Enlightenment whispered, "Correction." The gallows were renamed centers of reform. Torture chambers became interview rooms. The vocabulary was tender, the reality identical. Words had simply learned to wear gloves. Philosophers like Cesare Beccaria, in his On Crimes and Punishments, 1764, argued passionately that punishment should be proportionate, not vengeful. His ideas spread across Europe, influencing legal reforms from Vienna to Madrid. But as with all reforms, the theory traveled faster than the empathy behind it. Governments loved Beccaria's efficiency but ignored his humanity. They streamlined justice into a machine, precise but cold, moral in principle but mechanical in heart. And in the quieter corners of society, the old habits persisted. In rural villages, the pillory still stood. People still whispered about blasphemers struck by lightning, about thieves cursed to wander. The Enlightenment belonged to cities and books, not to the soil. The peasants carried their medieval ghosts forward, small and stubborn, like seeds lodged in their boots. The paradox was complete. Civilization had triumphed, yet the spectacle of punishment survived, refined, rationalized, industrialized. The guillotine replaced the wheel, but the crowd remained. They still came to watch, to cheer, to reassure themselves that justice was real and that fear was under control. In its own serene way, the 18th century proved that enlightenment and cruelty can coexist comfortably, as long as cruelty speaks politely. It no longer called itself divine wrath, called itself public order. The stage was set for a new kind of age, one that would claim to abolish cruelty altogether, even as it built systems vast enough to conceal it perfectly. The modern world was about to learn that invisibility could be its own form of punishment. By the early 19th century, Europe had grown weary of blood. The French Revolution had burned through its appetite for spectacle, and the guillotine, once the proud emblem of equality, now felt like a ghostly reminder of excess. Executions still happened, of course, but quietly, early in the morning, often behind prison walls. Civilization had declared itself civilized. It just preferred not to watch anymore. The old gallows were dismantled or left to rot. The pillory gathered moss. Even the executioner, once a grim celebrity, became a bureaucrat in uniform, his name filed away like an administrative code. The state no longer needed an audience. Justice had learned discretion. Punishment was no longer about drama. It was about duration. The spectacle of a single day was replaced by the slow grind of years. Instead of public agony, society discovered something far more efficient. The prison. Prisons had existed before, but they were holding pens, not instruments of correction. Now they became temples of reform. The New Age believed that isolation could cure sin, that solitude could restore morality. Architects built them as moral machines, cold, symmetrical, clean. The air smelled of limewash and regulation. Inside, everything was controlled. The hours of waking and sleeping, the portion of food, the length of a sermon, the number of words a prisoner could speak in a day. Silence was law. Conversation, laughter, even footsteps were measured. The prisoner was meant to reflect, to think, to improve. In practice, most went mad. The guiding philosophy was simple. If sin came from bad company, remove company. If it came from chaos, impose order. Thus was born the silent system, perfected in places like Pentonville and Philadelphia. Each inmate lived alone, in a narrow cell with a Bible, a bed, and a task. Work was constant but monotonous. Turning a crank, weaving rope, hammering nails. The sound of machinery replaced the sound of screams. The guards walked the corridors in soft shoes, watching through spy holes. The architecture itself enforced obedience. In some prisons, chapels were designed like pie charts, each pew separated by partitions so inmates could pray without seeing each other. Piety, privacy, punishment, three words that sounded holy when said together. From the outside, these institutions looked peaceful. No blood, no cries, no flames. Society congratulated itself on its humanity. The newspapers called them schools of virtue. Politicians toured them like museums, impressed by the discipline. They didn't hear the muffled sobbing through the walls. Workhouses adopted the same logic. Poverty, they decided, was a moral failing. Therefore, its cure must be unpleasant. The poor were housed, fed, and put to labor under strict conditions designed to discourage idleness. Families were separated, meals weighed, sleep timed. The system's cruelty lay not in excess but in precision. It didn't break bodies. It wore them down. The new science of criminology thrived in this environment. Doctors measured skulls, psychologists charted behavior, statisticians drew graphs of vice. Crime became a category, an equation to be solved. Each deviation from the norm required adjustment. Punishment became a form of calibration, less a response to wrongdoing than a maintenance of order. The moral vocabulary of the Middle Ages had evolved into the mechanical language of efficiency. And yet, despite the reforms, the same moral contradictions remained. The state claimed to be merciful, but mercy was now expressed through endless supervision. Freedom was granted only through conformity. The soul was no longer purified by fire but by paperwork. Writers noticed the irony. Charles Dickens visited prisons and described the perfect desolation of solitary confinement. Men turned inward until their own thoughts became instruments of torture. Victor Hugo called the penitentiary a tomb of the living. The Romantic poets saw in these walls the triumph of reason over compassion, the victory of systems over hearts. But the public loved the idea. Prisons felt safe, distant, respectable. They offered all the reassurance of punishment without the discomfort of proximity. Citizens could believe themselves humane while still enjoying the certainty that wrongdoers suffered somewhere out of sight. It was morality outsourced. The few who questioned it were dismissed as sentimental. Reformers argued that the system worked. Crime rates fell, order held, and the streets were quieter. Statistics replaced conscience. As long as the numbers improved, what happened behind the gates didn't matter. What made this new age particularly chilling was its calmness. The violence of the past had been noisy, chaotic, easy to condemn. The violence of the prison was silent, rational, written in ledgers and blueprints. There was no blood to stain the conscience, no screams to haunt the night. The cruelty had learned to whisper. In this silence, a new kind of punishment emerged: surveillance. The idea that to be watched was itself corrective. The state extended its gaze beyond prisons into schools, factories, hospitals. Discipline became architecture, a way of arranging space so that people behaved. Bentham's panopticon was no longer just a dream. It became the blueprint for an age. Every office, every classroom, every regimented corridor carried its echo. People learned to watch themselves, to internalize authority. The whip was gone, but the eyes remained. Obedience no longer required pain, just the possibility of being seen. The irony was exquisite. Civilization had achieved what centuries of torture could not: self-regulating citizens. The perfect punishment was no longer physical. It was psychological, invisible, polite. The modern soul, well-behaved and anxious, was born. But even this new civility had its cracks. Revolutionaries and poets alike began to notice that rational cruelty might be worse than the old kind. At least the medieval world admitted its brutality. The new world hid it behind ideals. A quick death at the scaffold had been replaced by a slow erasure of identity, a lifetime of quiet correction. The body survived, but the self disappeared. Still, for most of the 19th century, society celebrated its progress. The word rehabilitation appeared in official reports. Chaplains preached redemption through industry. Philanthropists donated books and sewing machines to prisons. Visitors left impressed, remarking on the orderliness, the cleanliness, the silence. No one mentioned the loneliness. And perhaps that was the final evolution of medieval punishment, the shift from noise to quiet, from public fear to private despair. The flames had gone out, but the cold remained. The body no longer screamed, yet the mind never stopped. This was the age of silent punishment, neat, efficient, and endless. The 19th century prided itself on progress. Factories multiplied, railways spanned continents, and the world seemed to shrink beneath the logic of machines. Everything from steam engines to moral philosophy was measured, timed, and catalogued. People called it the age of improvement. But improvement always demands control, and control always needs punishment. The more organized the world became, the more invisible its cruelties grew. Industrialization didn't just change how things were made. It changed how people were managed. The same rhythm that governed factory bells began to govern bodies. Time, discipline, obedience, these became virtues. The worker who arrived late sinned not against God, but against efficiency. And in an age that equated order with morality, inefficiency itself became a crime. The old spectacle of punishment, executions, public shame, gave way to systems of quiet enforcement. Rules replaced rituals. Paper replaced rope. Yet the spirit behind them hadn't changed at all. Humanity had merely found subtler tools. Across Europe, prisons multiplied. Workhouses expanded. As empires grew, so did their appetite for regulation. Colonial administrators exported their legal codes to distant territories, convinced that order could be shipped overseas in crates of parchment and red wax seals. Wherever the flag went, so did the cell, the gallows, and the bureaucrat. Punishment became an export. The British Empire, especially, treated its penal system as both moral mission and business model. Convicts from crowded London jails were shipped to Australia, their exile doubling as colonization. The voyage itself was a punishment. Months in cramped holds, fettered in chains, watched over by guards who alternated between cruelty and boredom. When they arrived, they built the settlements that would one day claim to represent civilization. It was redemption through geography. Crime transformed into empire, suffering into infrastructure. In India, Prisons followed the same blueprint: clean, geometric, and severe. Officials spoke of moral reform and public hygiene while designing cells that mimicked the precision of factories. A governor in Calcutta proudly described his new penitentiary as a triumph of administration. It was efficient, he wrote, because the prisoners worked 12 hours a day and never spoke. Silence and sweat, apparently the twin foundations of progress. Europe itself wasn't much gentler. Industrial cities filled with migrants and laborers, and with them came new anxieties about disorder. Crime was redefined not as sin but as deviation. The state's goal shifted from punishing individuals to managing populations. Statistics became the new scripture. Governments published crime rates as proof of moral health, the way medieval kings once displayed relics. The result was the birth of police as we understand it, a permanent professional force dedicated not to hunting criminals after the fact, but to preventing misbehavior altogether. Prevention required surveillance, classification, and endless paperwork. For the first time, citizens were not just ruled, they were recorded. Birth certificates, addresses, fingerprints, photographs, the cataloging of identity became the new frontier of control. The French called it la bureaucratie morale, the moral bureaucracy. Its agents carried notebooks instead of swords, pens instead of whips, but the effect was much the same. The citizen who broke the rules found himself entangled in a web of forms, fines, and laws that were impossible to escape. The punishment wasn't spectacular, it was exhausting. In Britain, reformers continued to preach about rehabilitation. The word sounded noble, modern, humane, but rehabilitation often meant nothing more than obedience training. The prison remained a factory of discipline, grinding individuality into routine. Inspectors published glowing reports about the success of their systems, measuring virtue by productivity. A well-behaved prisoner was not one who had changed his soul, but one who had stopped making trouble. In the colonies, this ideology metastasized into something more sinister. Their punishment was not about reform but about hierarchy. Indigenous peoples were classified as immature, uncivilized, in need of correction. European law declared itself universal, and resistance to it became both crime and sin. The lash, the chain gang, and the forced plantation were all justified as instruments of enlightenment. The empire's cruelty spoke with the calm voice of improvement. And at home, industrial society quietly turned the working class into its own form of captivity. The factory bell replaced the prison bell. Wages replaced rations. Laborers were free only to work, their time owned by someone else from dawn to dusk. The rhythm of punishment had seeped into daily life so thoroughly that no one noticed. Writers did. Dickens, again, called London a city built on discipline and fog. The philosopher John Stuart Mill, champion of liberty, admitted that civilization seemed to require a degree of restraint that bordered on coercion. But for every voice of concern, there were 10 proclaiming the triumph of modernity. After all, there were fewer hangings now, fewer public whippings. The cruelty had been contained. Surely that was progress. What these optimists missed was that cruelty had simply learned patience. It no longer needed to destroy the body when it could occupy the mind. The new punishments worked through habit, fatigue, and fear of losing one's place. People obeyed not because they were beaten, but because they couldn't afford not to. It was the quiet victory of structure over spirit. Meanwhile, the old punishments, those relics of fire and iron, didn't disappear entirely. They lingered in the corners of the empire, in outposts far from the newspapers. Colonial prisons, debtor camps, and military garrisons kept the older traditions alive. There, men were still whipped, starved, and worked to death under the same sun that shone on the polished streets of Paris and London. Civilization's conscience was selective. By the century's end, Philosophers like Michel Foucault would look back and call this transformation a microphysics of power. Authority no longer relied on terror. It relied on detail. The world had become a grid, each life a small square on the map of governance. Punishment was everywhere and nowhere at once. And yet, for all its precision, this empire of order carried a deep unease. Reformers began to notice that prisons didn't reform, that poverty kept refilling them faster than discipline could empty them. Crime persisted like a stubborn echo, suggesting that maybe the problem wasn't wickedness but the system itself. But systems are slow to doubt. It would take another century and 2 world wars before anyone truly reconsidered what justice meant. For now, the 19th century rested smugly in its faith in progress. It believed it had outgrown barbarism, that its punishments were humane, its institutions wise, its laws perfect. The gallows had been replaced by the ledger, and that seemed like victory enough. But deep down, the same old fears remained, the fear of chaos, of disobedience, of losing control. The Middle Ages had prayed to God for order. The modern world prayed to statistics. Both built temples of suffering in his or its name. The lights of the factories burned late into the night, and the guards in their towers watched silently, clipboards in hand, recording every movement. Civilization slept soundly, unaware that it was dreaming the same dream all over again. The 20th century inherited all the tools of modernity but none of its humility. After centuries of perfecting bureaucracy, industry, and propaganda, the world had found the most efficient way to repeat its oldest mistake. It wrapped cruelty in progress, stamped it with national emblems, and called it ideology. Punishment, once the business of kings and priests, now belonged to states. War turned the entire century into one long demonstration of what discipline could achieve when mixed with fear. Soldiers marched in rhythm, factories produced weapons with clockwork precision, and entire populations were measured, numbered, and filed. The dream of order that had haunted the Middle Ages returned, only now it had electricity and paperwork. The same scientific spirit that built hospitals also built camps. The difference was only intent. Systems of surveillance, classification, and correction, once limited to prisons, expanded across continents. The panopticon that Bentham had imagined as a metaphor became real, multiplied by millions of eyes and ledgers. In totalitarian states, punishment lost even the pretense of morality. It became administrative. People vanished not because they were guilty, but because the record said they should vanish. The logic was chillingly familiar. The state as the guardian of purity, the body politic needing cleansing. Medieval sin had simply changed its vocabulary. Heresy was now ideology. Confession was now confession under duress. The faces changed, but the rhythm was the same. Technology made cruelty efficient. Railways transported prisoners to their fates faster than any inquisitor's horse could ride. Telegraphs and later telephones coordinated the machinery of imprisonment with surgical precision. The bureaucracy of pain no longer required a crowd. It required forms. Even the language was recycled. Words like re-education, rehabilitation, and cleansing carried the same sanctimonious tone as redemption once had. Every camp, every gulag, every labor colony promised improvement. What it delivered was obedience through exhaustion. People were not executed for spectacle anymore. They were simply erased, statistically and quietly, as if subtraction were the gentlest form of violence. Liberal democracies congratulated themselves on being different, but their punishments evolved in parallel. Their prisons grew larger, their surveillance subtler. Science replaced theology as the moral compass, and psychologists took the place of priests. Instead of sin, there was pathology. Instead of penance, treatment. The purpose remained the same: to make deviance normal, to restore order. The First World War turned soldiers into numbers and death into logistics. The Second industrialized both. Between them, humanity learned that modernity could kill with more politeness than any medieval hangman. There were no public executions, no cheering crowds, just camps, trenches, and bureaucratic efficiency. Pain became invisible, tucked neatly behind euphemisms and patriotic slogans. After the wars, when the world tried to rebuild itself, it faced an uncomfortable question. How do you punish evil when punishment itself has become suspect? The Nuremberg trials, with their solemn procedures and insistence on legality, were an attempt to answer that. Justice had to be visible again, but not vengeful. The executioners of the 20th century were men with gavels and translators, not swords. Yet even there, the old theater flickered through. Cameras rolled. The sentences were announced like liturgies. Humanity still needed its rituals. Meanwhile, in everyday life, punishment retreated further into subtlety. Schools adopted discipline systems modeled after prisons, rows, bells, supervision. Factories refined their rules until punctuality became a moral virtue. Nations measured citizens by productivity. In the new economy, failure itself was a kind of crime, punished not by lash or cell but by exclusion. The unemployed, the poor, the unfit, all absorbed the lesson that to fall behind was to be judged. Media became the new town square. Newspapers and, later, television carried out moral corrections in public view. Names of criminals printed in columns replaced bodies hanging on scaffolds. Reputation again became a form of justice. Where once villagers threw cabbages, audiences now threw headlines. The Cold War refined surveillance into an art. Intelligence agencies, secret police, and informant networks covered the planet in invisible observation. The state no longer needed to show its power. It only needed people to feel watched. Fear became internal, private, a whisper instead of a scream. In that quiet, punishment reached its most elegant form, self-censorship. By the time the century drew to a close, societies had convinced themselves they had transcended brutality. Executions were rare, torture illegal, prisons humane on paper. But every law, every reform, every camera on every corner carried the same heartbeat of control. Civilization had succeeded not in erasing its cruelty, but in making it quiet enough to ignore. In this world of fluorescent light and quiet bureaucracy, the medieval instinct survived perfectly disguised. The desire to purify, to cleanse, to order, to separate good from evil never left. It simply traded the cross for the clipboard, the torch for the typewriter. The punishment of the body had evolved into the management of the soul, and most people didn't even notice. Even the idea of hell had migrated. It no longer burned beneath the earth. It existed in memory, in archives, in endless documentation. Once a person was recorded as deviant, the mark stayed, digital ink instead of a brand. The same logic that nailed ears to posts now existed in data servers. Every transgression, every misstep, logged and stored. The irony is almost gentle. Medieval people believed God saw everything. Modern people believe the government does. Either way, someone's watching, and the moral of the story hasn't changed. Behave. The 20th century had perfected a truth its ancestors only suspected, that the most efficient punishment doesn't end life. It organizes it. The ideal subject wasn't the tortured or the executed. It was the obedient, endlessly monitored, quietly afraid. The old punishments, the wheel, the stake, the pillory, look barbaric now precisely because they were honest. They showed their cruelty. The modern world hides it behind policy, behind progress, behind the phrase, for your own safety. Humanity still disciplines itself, only now it does so politely. History rarely changes, it just adjusts the lighting. And in that soft light, the ghost of the medieval mind still lingers. Tamed, refined, but never gone. There's a quiet weight that hangs over history's oldest punishments, a kind of stillness that feels almost reverent. When you look at the drawings of those medieval squares, the rough sketches of gallows and crowds, it's not just the brutality that catches the eye. It's the calm, the patience, the way everyone, from the priest to the beggar, stood watching as though witnessing not horror, but ceremony. That's what punishment was to them, a ceremony, a communal exorcism. Each act of pain performed publicly so that everyone could leave feeling lighter, cleaner, less afraid. The condemned was a vessel, carrying away the village's sin. It's cruel, yes, but also deeply human. Because it wasn't just about cruelty, it was about meaning. The medieval world gave pain a purpose. They turned suffering into order. And that's the thread that still runs through everything we've built since. The forms are different now, sterile, administrative, quiet, but the function hasn't changed. We still need someone to carry the burden of wrong. We still need to see punishment, even if we only see its shadow. Because without it, the illusion of order trembles. In the centuries after the last public executions, the gallows began to disappear, swallowed by grass and cobblestones. The stains faded, but the spaces remained. In Paris, where bodies once hung on the Montfaucon gallows, there's now a quiet intersection, lined with cafes. In London, Tyburn's wooden frame is gone, but a plaque remains, politely understated as if to whisper, "We remember, but let's not talk about it too loudly." That's the tone the modern world adopted about its past. We remember selectively. We build museums and memorials, displaying torture devices in glass cases, but never lingering too long. We call it history as if that makes it safe. But these relics aren't just about what was done. They're about what was believed. And belief, unlike iron, doesn't rust. What those people believed, what they knew, was that the world needed pain to stay in balance. It wasn't cruelty. It was cosmology. Every blow of the whip, every burning pyre, every severed hand, it all fit into a larger pattern. A universe that punished disobedience was a universe that made sense. They feared chaos far more than they feared cruelty. That's a feeling we still understand, though we rarely admit it. Modern life is chaos disguised as order. Everything runs on systems so intricate they feel divine. Algorithms, laws, surveillance. Each one a quiet little cathedral of control. We've just swapped our priests for policymakers and our sermons for notifications. But the message hasn't changed. Obey or face consequence. And we obey, not out of fear of flames or gallows, but because we've been taught that obedience is safety. That order, even when unfair, is preferable to uncertainty. The medievals feared sin. We fear collapse. And fear, as ever, demands its rituals. There's a strange beauty in how the Middle Ages built those rituals. Their punishments, as horrific as they were, carried symbolism. A thief's hand cut off so he'd never steal again. A liar's tongue burned so it could no longer spread deceit. It was literal-minded justice, naive but poetic. Our punishments now are far less symbolic, but no less deliberate. We erase rather than scar. We silence rather than cut. We hide what we once displayed. And yet, in hiding it, we've only made it stronger. Because the fear of punishment has always been more powerful than punishment itself. The medievals knew that too. The gallows didn't just kill. It reminded everyone living what awaited them if they strayed. Fear was the true sentence. Death was just punctuation. That's why, even in its absence, the scaffold still casts a shadow. Its outline is etched into our collective psychology. Every rule, every law, every unspoken social code, all of it built on the same foundation. The memory of the square, the crowd, the consequence. Even without the ropes and irons, we live in a world still arranged around their ghost. But there's another, quieter inheritance from that time. One that's harder to see, but just as enduring, the longing for redemption. The idea that punishment, if endured, might lead somewhere higher. The condemned prayed for forgiveness, not freedom. They believed their suffering would purify them. That belief gave their pain meaning. Without it, pain is just noise. And perhaps that's what modern punishment has lost. Its story. The medieval world, brutal as it was, believed that every lash of the whip was part of a divine script. Our punishments are clinical, detached, procedural. There's no narrative, just consequence. We've kept the machinery but dismantled the myth. Maybe that's why justice feels hollow now. We've forgotten the script but still perform the play. The irony is that mercy, real mercy, was always the thing the medievals claimed to understand least, yet needed most. Mercy disrupted order. Mercy made power nervous. It made God unpredictable. The same holds true now. To forgive freely without performance is to refuse the ritual entirely. And humanity, for all its progress, still isn't ready for that. Mercy feels dangerous because it unravels the thread of control. It tells us that pain isn't necessary, that suffering doesn't have to balance the scales. And if that's true, if justice doesn't require pain, then what has all of history been for? That's the quiet question that lingers when you walk past those old punishment sites, now turned into cafes or gardens. The stones remember what people would rather forget. The air carries the faint echo of order, the rhythm of fear. But the world has learned to hum over it, to keep moving, to call it progress. Maybe that's what progress really is, not the end of cruelty, but the ability to ignore its continuity, to make the pain invisible, the punishment clean, the system respectable. Civilization doesn't destroy its scaffolds. It just builds new ones out of subtler materials. Words, rules, screens, time. And so the story of medieval punishment ends where it began, in silence. The square is empty now. The torches are out. The crowd has gone home. But the idea, the faith, the comfort of cruelty, it lingers. Quiet, disciplined, enduring. Because in the end, the scaffold was never about the wood or the rope. It was about us. About the part of humanity that still believes pain can make the world right again. About the faint, unbreakable conviction that justice, to be real, must hurt. That belief, older than kings, older than cathedrals, older than mercy itself, still stands. Invisible now, unspoken, but alive. Always alive. And as the centuries fade and the cities hum, you can still feel it. Beneath the asphalt, beneath the glass, beneath every sentence ever passed. An echo steady and soft as breath. The sound of a world still punishing itself in the dark. Sometimes, late at night, when the world grows quiet enough, it's almost possible to hear the hum of history beneath the surface of things. The sound isn't loud. It's steady, like distant machinery, turning just out of sight. That hum is the memory of punishment. The low, persistent rhythm of a species that learned long ago to define itself through suffering. Civilization, for all its lights and rhetoric, still stands on that foundation. We may no longer build scaffolds in the square or brand thieves in the marketplace, but we still build systems that whisper the same promise. Disobey, and pain will follow. It's written in our contracts, our laws, our social codes. The old wooden beams have been replaced with paper and policy, but the architecture hasn't changed. Every rule carries a ghost of the gallows in its shadow. The medieval world never truly left us because it wasn't a period, it was a habit. The habit of equating control with goodness, obedience with virtue, pain with purification. It's an idea so deeply woven into human behavior that we barely notice it anymore. We dress it in the language of order, safety, reform, but it's the same instinct that drove villagers to gather at dawn to watch someone pay. Think about how often the word deserve appears in our daily language. Deserve success, deserve punishment, deserve happiness. Deserve pain is a medieval word at heart, born from theology, sharpened by law. It carries the echo of divine balance, the old conviction that life must be measured by suffering. If good things happen without pain, we call them unearned. If bad things happen without punishment, we call it unfair. Fairness, to the human mind, has always meant the even distribution of agony. In a sense, that's what made the Middle Ages so consistent. They didn't hide from that logic, they lived by it. The courtrooms, the sermons, the punishments, all of it was one continuous reminder that life was supposed to hurt. And if you were lucky, that hurt meant salvation. We like to think we've outgrown that, but the idea hasn't gone anywhere. It just learned to speak in secular terms. The modern world punishes in quieter ways. Taxes, fines, suspensions, isolation, shame, but it punishes constantly. Every institution we build has its version of the scaffold, even if it's only symbolic. The workplace demotes instead of flogs. The school expels instead of brands. The government imprisons instead of executes. It's all calibrated to maintain order, but beneath the bureaucracy, it's still ritual. Still the same psychological contract. You will suffer, and in that suffering, the world will stay balanced. What the Middle Ages understood, and what we've simply forgotten how to admit, is that punishment isn't just about control. It's about reassurance. People feared sin, chaos, rebellion, not because they loved obedience, but because they feared meaninglessness. Punishment made the world make sense. It turned random cruelty into moral narrative. The criminal wasn't just unlucky, he was wrong. The punishment proved it. It gave suffering a reason, and a reason, no matter how cruel, is easier to live with than chaos. That's the strange comfort buried inside cruelty. The comfort of knowing that there's order, that every pain means something, that every wound is part of a moral equation. The Middle Ages lived inside that comfort completely. We, on the other hand, live in the shadow of its collapse. We have science, psychology, probability. We know that pain is random now, but we still crave the illusion that it isn't. So we keep inventing new forms of justice to keep the story alive. Even mercy, our proudest modern invention, is built on the same old scaffolding. Mercy is only powerful when it's withheld from most and given to few. A medieval king sparing a condemned man didn't dismantle the scaffold. He reinforced it. His mercy mattered precisely because the structure of cruelty stood solid around it. That dynamic hasn't changed. We still talk about earning forgiveness, as if kindness must be balanced against pain to feel authentic. And yet, what if the real heresy, both then and now, isn't disobedience but mercy itself? What if the thing the medieval world feared most wasn't sin, but the possibility that suffering wasn't necessary at all? Mercy undermines the whole architecture of power. It says that order can exist without pain, that redemption doesn't need proof. For a society built on control, that's chaos. The gallows could withstand rebellion, but not forgiveness. That's why, through all those centuries, cruelty survived better than compassion. Cruelty organizes, simplifies, it gives people roles. Victim, executioner, witness. Compassion, on the other hand, blurs those lines. It asks for empathy instead of certainty. And certainty, especially in uncertain times, is addictive. The medieval world clung to it, we still do. Walk through any major city today, New York, London, Rome, and you'll see the remnants of that addiction everywhere. Court buildings shaped like temples, statues of blindfolded justice holding scales, police stations built like fortresses. The architecture of order still speaks in the same medieval grammar. Even the quiet hum of a surveillance camera feels like the reincarnation of the watchtower. We've replaced chains with data, ropes with records, but the goal hasn't changed. Keep everyone visible, obedient, contained. And perhaps that's why medieval punishment still captivates us. Not just because it was gruesome, but because it was honest. It wore its power on the outside. There was no pretense of benevolence, no illusion of reform. You knew who ruled you, how they ruled, and what would happen if you defied them. Our modern systems hide the same truth behind the language of progress. We call it reform, security, responsibility. But every reform still demands a victim. Every law still needs an example. Every society still feeds on fear. The gallows were dismantled, but the lesson remained. The rope was never the real instrument of control, it was the watching crowd. The crowd is eternal. It only changes shape. It becomes the public, the electorate, the audience. Still gathers, still waits, still demands that someone hang. And when they do, the world exhales. The balance restored, at least for a while. The hum grows steady again. Civilization, reassured, goes back to sleep. But beneath that sleep, beneath the hum and the laws and the order, the same old question keeps turning. What if pain was never necessary? What if we built all of this, the courts, the prisons, the punishments, not out of wisdom but out of fear? What if the Middle Ages weren't an era of ignorance, but a mirror showing us what we still are, only better dressed? The answer, like the scaffold, waits quietly in the dark, unchanged, unrepentant, and very much alive. By now, the story of punishment feels less like history and more like a reflection. One that moves when we move, one that doesn't fade no matter how many centuries we walk away from it. The Middle Ages are gone, but their mirror still stands, polished by every generation that believes it has finally outgrown cruelty. We stare into it and see the same thing. The need for control, the comfort of fear, the old conviction that pain keeps the world still. There's a strange kind of peace in that realization. Because if cruelty has always been with us, maybe it isn't a flaw, it's a language. One humanity keeps speaking, century after century, to make sense of itself. The medieval scaffold, the prison cell, the courtroom, they're all just dialects of the same sentence. We will not let chaos win. It's easy to imagine the Middle Ages as a time of darkness, superstition, and unreason, but really, it was a time of certainty. Everyone knew their place in the great chain of being. God at the top, peasants at the bottom, pain distributed neatly in between. The system worked not because it was fair, but because it was familiar. And that's what punishment gives us, more than anything else, familiarity. The assurance that no matter how much the world changes, consequence remains constant. In the quiet after a medieval execution, that was what people felt. Not horror, not pity, but relief, a deep moral sigh that said, "The world is right again." The condemned was gone, the balance restored, the crowd absolved. And then life went on, bread to bake, fields to till, prayers to mumble. Pain, resolved into order, allowed life to resume. Modern life hums with that same rhythm, just in smaller, subtler doses. Every scandal quenched by an apology, every law enforced, every punishment served. It's all the same choreography. We punish not only to correct, but to continue. Without that ritual, society stalls. Forgiveness, for all its virtue, halts the cycle. Punishment keeps it moving. It's the engine of order. But what happens when the engine keeps running long after it's needed? That's the question the modern world hasn't answered. We've built entire systems designed to sustain punishment indefinitely. Lifetime sentences, blacklists, exile in everything but name. We've learned how to punish people forever, even without fire or rope. The Middle Ages at least ended their punishments quickly. They made pain a moment. We've turned it into a condition. And maybe that's why the ghost of that old world lingers so powerfully. It reminds us that the line between justice and cruelty has always been paper thin, and we keep redrawing it without ever erasing it. We've just shifted where we're willing to look. The Middle Ages demanded that punishment be seen. We demand that it be hidden. Both forms, in their own way, keep the machine running. Every now and then, though, history flickers, the mirror clears, and we catch a glimpse of what we've become. A surveillance camera mounted on a street corner. A data file storing every fine, every debt, every mistake. A news feed erupting in collective condemnation. Different tools, same theater. The stage lights have changed, but the play never stopped. If a medieval monk could walk among us now, he might recognize more than we'd like to admit. He'd see confession in our interviews, penance in our apologies, and excommunication in our cancellations. He'd nod in approval at the structure, even if he couldn't recognize the words. We've simply replaced prayers with press releases, lashes with headlines, cathedrals with courthouses. The ritual still makes sense. It still sings the same refrain: obedience, repentance, consequence. What's fascinating, and maybe a little tragic, is that no one ever questioned whether the ritual actually worked. Not then, not now. The medieval world believed punishment saved souls. We believe it saves societies. Neither belief has much proof, but both soothe the collective anxiety that without pain, order will crumble. We don't punish to prevent wrongdoing, we punish to feel stable. And that, perhaps, is the secret the Middle Ages understood better than we do. That justice isn't about fairness but reassurance. They never pretended otherwise. Their courts were brutal but honest. A lord punished to remind his peasants who ruled. A bishop punished to remind sinners who judged. It wasn't hypocrisy, it was ceremony. And ceremonies don't need logic, they need belief. Our world, too, is full of ceremonies. The sterile courtroom, the solemn sentencing, the public apology broadcast and consumed. We go through the motions not because we believe in change, but because we believe in rhythm. The form comforts us even when the meaning fades. The punishment doesn't have to fix anything. It just has to happen. That's why cruelty, for all its horror, endures so easily. It fills silence. It makes chaos predictable. Even when it fails, it feels right. The medievals might have called that faith. We call it justice. It's the same spell whispered in a different age. And maybe that's why the image of the scaffold, rotting quietly in an overgrown field, feels so heavy when we think about it. It's not just an artifact, it's a monument to the part of us that still believes order needs a body to balance it. Somewhere deep in our collective mind, we're still standing in that square, still watching, still waiting for the rope to tighten so that we can breathe again. The modern world is full of ghosts like that, echoes of punishment that have outlived their purpose. But maybe they remain because we still need them. Civilization, after all, is a story we tell ourselves about control. And every story, no matter how enlightened, needs a villain. The Middle Ages gave theirs faces, we give ours files. So the mirror stays unbroken. Each century looks into it and sees itself reflected in softer light. But the outline never changes. A world built on fear of chaos. A crowd waiting for consequence. Promise that pain will keep the peace. And until we learn to live without that promise, until we can imagine order that doesn't need a scaffold's shadow, we'll keep turning the same page, repeating the same story. The gallows will remain invisible, but never gone. Just behind the curtain, just beneath the surface, waiting for the next act. Because history, like justice, never really ends. It just lowers its voice and waits to be believed again. Civilization prides itself on progress. We tell ourselves that we've moved past superstition, that reason has replaced ritual, that law has refined justice. And yet, beneath that confident veneer, punishment remains our oldest companion. Faithful, adaptable, quietly unshakable. It has survived revolutions, philosophies, empires, and renaissances because it feeds something deeper than politics. It feeds our need for certainty. The medieval world made that certainty visible. Their justice was carved in public, literal, unmistakable, theatrical. Theirs was a sentence with an exclamation mark. Ours, however, has become a paragraph that never ends. The condemned no longer hang from ropes. They hang in databases, in court records, in search results. The pain is slower now, dispersed, procedural, but it never truly stops. The punishment continues long after the sentence ends, and we call that efficiency. There's something almost poetic about how we've turned time itself into the new instrument of control. The medievals used fire, the wheel, the blade. We use waiting, a life behind bars, a lifetime of debt, the unending echo of a mistake recorded forever. It's quieter, but not gentler. If anything, it's more complete. Where the old world punished the body, we punish the entire span of existence. It's ironic. The very societies that claim to have abolished cruelty have perfected its endurance. The whip leaves marks that fade. The record does not. We've built a world where forgetting is harder than forgiveness. Memory, stored and searchable, has become the new scaffold. The digital crowd never disperses. The punishment never loses its audience. What's more haunting is that this evolution feels natural to us. We've grown so accustomed to monitoring, measuring, and judging that the line between justice and curiosity has vanished. We scroll through trials, sentences, scandals with the same quiet absorption that our ancestors once brought to public executions. No screams, no blood, no torches, just the same ancient satisfaction wrapped in pixels and distance. The human appetite for witnessing consequence never really left. It just adapted to broadband. Perhaps that's the final inheritance from the medieval world. The belief that to live rightly, one must live watched. The Middle Ages had God and the Church for that. Eyes that saw everything, weighed everything, forgave conditionally. We've simply replaced them with systems, algorithms, and endless documentation. Every act is logged, every word archived, every infraction timestamped. It's not divine omniscience anymore, it's administrative omnipresence. And just like the medieval mind, we find comfort in that surveillance. Promises order, promises fairness, promises a world where nothing escapes consequence. But what it really promises, what it's always promised, is control through fear. The scaffold kept people in line not because they saw death, but because they feared being seen. The same logic hums behind every modern screen. Visibility remains the most effective punishment of all. In a way, the medieval world was more merciful because its punishments had endings. A blade fell, a rope tightened, a fire went out. Pain concluded, however brutally. The condemned died and were gone. The living moved on. Now the sentence rarely ends. We've invented eternal punishments for mortal beings. Lives defined by error, identities reduced to what was once done. It's a more sophisticated cruelty. Endless consequence disguised as justice. And still, the cycle persists. The same need to restore balance, to witness correction, to make wrongness visible. We can't escape it because it's older than civilization itself. Punishment is the heartbeat of order. The medievals just heard it louder. They tuned their entire culture to its rhythm. We've turned down the volume, but the pulse remains steady. If you listen closely, beyond the noise of traffic, the hum of screens, the bureaucracy of justice, you can still hear it. A steady echo under every courtroom oath, every law written, every judgment passed. It's the sound of the same ancient machine turning, the same ancient comfort repeating. The world must hurt to stay whole. And maybe that's the real tragedy. Not that the Middle Ages were cruel, but that they were honest about it. They knew pain was their foundation. We've built the same structure and covered it in glass and light, pretending we don't see what holds it up. But the foundation doesn't care. It just waits, quietly, unchallenged, century after century. Someday, perhaps, we'll learn to live without it. To believe that order can exist without punishment, that peace doesn't require pain, that mercy doesn't undermine meaning. But for now, the world still spins on the same old axis: fear, consequence, and control. The scaffold is gone, but its logic remains, written not in wood or iron, but in us, in how we speak, how we judge, how we watch. A ghost that no longer needs form to keep us in line. A sentence that never really ended, just changed tense. And so the story fades to quiet. The torches are cold, the crowds dispersed, the gallows dust. Yet somewhere, deep beneath the hum of civilization, the same rhythm endures. A slow, patient heartbeat reminding us that the Middle Ages never truly died. They were simply renamed. History books love clean endings. They tell us that the Middle Ages ended with the Renaissance, as though humanity simply woke up one morning, opened a window, and decided to stop being medieval. But eras don't end. They just change clothes. The torchlight of one century becomes the glow of another's screen. The same instincts remain. Tidied, rationalized, domesticated, but not gone. We still live in that same kingdom, only now the throne is invisible. The rules are quieter, the punishments bureaucratic, the faith secular. The medieval world believed in divine order. We believe in systemic order. Both serve the same master, the fear of collapse. Every age invents its own vocabulary for control, and every age insists that its methods are humane. Look closely and you'll see how our own world resembles theirs, down to the smallest gesture. There are still confessions, only now they happen in public statements, apologies crafted by teams of lawyers. There are still pilgrimages, rehabilitative programs, press tours, rituals of repentance. There are still inquisitors, commentators, judges, boards. And there is still an audience. Always an audience. Watching, weighing, deciding when the sinner has suffered enough. The medievals didn't invent the spectacle of judgment. They just perfected it. They made punishment a language everyone understood. The scar, the brand, the gallows, they were moral punctuation marks. Now, our marks are digital, invisible, but they cut just as deep. A reputation ruined online lasts longer than a scar ever did. The scaffold has been replaced by search engines, and the sentence, like history itself, is permanent. But perhaps the most medieval part of modern life is the way we hide cruelty behind virtue. When a king burned heretics, he said it was for their souls. When we ostracize, isolate, or erase, we say it's for justice. The reasoning has always been the same. Pain is necessary for purity. We've just swapped heaven for ethics, priests for policies. The faith hasn't changed, only its hymns. If you strip away the language, what remains is the same old craving. The desire to see wrongness transformed into suffering. Not out of malice, but out of fear. We punish to reassure ourselves that chaos can still be tamed. That we still have control over a world that feels increasingly unstable. The medieval crowd felt it too. That rush of unity when the rope tightened, that collective calm when order was restored. They weren't cheering the death of a person. They were cheering the survival of meaning. And in that sense, we are still their descendants. Every time a headline breaks, every time a scandal unravels, every time someone is brought to justice, we gather again in the square, digitally now, silently perhaps, but no less intently. We call it awareness. We call it accountability. But it's the same ritual performed in modern light. The same murmur passes through the crowd. Balance has been restored. Even the architecture of our cities remembers. The courthouses, with their pillars and domes, still look like cathedrals. The prisons, hidden at the edges of towns, still carry the chill of medieval dungeons. We call them correctional facilities, but they serve the same purpose. Containment of disorder, physical proof that the system still has teeth. What's fascinating, almost beautiful in its bleakness, is how deeply we still rely on pain to define morality. The medievals had their saints and martyrs. We have our second chances, our public acts of contrition. In both worlds, redemption only counts if it hurts first. Suffering remains the only acceptable evidence of change. Maybe that's the last relic we'll ever shake off. The conviction that pain gives life meaning. The medieval mind turned that conviction into theology. We turned it into psychology. They said suffering saves souls. We say it builds character. But both statements carry the same quiet faith. That to hurt is to grow. That without punishment, there can be no progress. But there's another truth buried under that. A softer one the medieval world barely dared to touch, and we still hesitate to face. Mercy is harder than punishment not because it's weak, but because it has no performance. Mercy doesn't give the crowd closure. It leaves the story open, unresolved, unsettling. It says there's no neat ending, no balance restored, no relief through pain. Mercy requires living with imperfection, and that, for most societies, has always been intolerable. Perhaps one day, when the machinery of punishment finally grows too heavy to bear, mercy will take its place. Perhaps we'll learn that order doesn't have to be maintained through fear, that chaos isn't the enemy, but the space where humanity breathes. But that day hasn't come yet. For now, the world still stands on its old foundations. Stone and iron, fear and law. The torches may have dimmed, the crowds dispersed, but the scaffold's shadow stretches across time, touching every courtroom, every prison, every quiet moment of judgment we pass on one another. The medievals would recognize it instantly. The kingdom never ended. It simply learned to smile. And somewhere, behind the polished glass of modern life, the whisper of the old world still hums. Pain keeps order. Punishment keeps peace. Suffering makes sense. The crowd nods, the light fades, and history, as always, begins again. There's a strange comfort in structure. Even the most chaotic age clings to its rules, its rituals, its soft promises that everything can be measured, managed, balanced. In that way, the medieval world never really vanished. It just got better at hiding behind order. The punishments that once echoed through public squares now hum through fluorescent-lit offices and computer screens. The same machinery still turns, steady as ever, powered not by faith in God but by faith in systems. We still believe, as those villagers once did, that a world without consequence is a world without meaning. Every form, every law, every sentence begins with the same quiet conviction that someone must be held accountable. Not because it will fix the past, but because it will make us feel safer in the present. The medievals knew that instinct well. Their punishments were harsh, yes, but also strangely tender in their way. They reflected a deep human need to prove that suffering can clean the slate. Today, we call it serving time. Such a gentle phrase. You serve as though punishment were a kind of civic hospitality. But what we've really built is a new form of penance, stretched across years. The walls are cleaner, the air more breathable, the language softer, but it's the same idea. Order maintained through isolation. Morality measured by obedience. Civilization just learned to make its cruelty polite. You can see it most clearly in how we talk about justice now. Everything is procedural. We talk about process, about balance, about systems that work. But the heart of it, the raw, trembling question of why we need pain at all, never enters the conversation. We speak of punishment as if it were gravity. Inevitable, natural, unquestionable. The Middle Ages called it divine law, we call it social order. The name changed, the reverence didn't. Every society has its sacred things, and in ours, justice is one of them. To question its necessity feels almost heretical. And yet, if you stripped away the ceremony, the robes, the gavels, the endless paperwork, you'd find something disarmingly familiar. The same old scaffolding, invisible now but unbroken. the same instinct to make someone an example, the same hunger for equilibrium, the same fear that mercy might undo it all. The medievals at least had the honesty to call it faith. They said punishment was God's will, a holy balance between sin and grace. We say it's reason, evidence, responsibility. But both stories serve the same purpose: to make suffering seem righteous, to make control seem moral. And maybe that's the quiet genius of humanity. We can turn anything into meaning. The same impulse that built cathedrals built prisons. The same reverence that prayed for forgiveness also sharpened the axe. It's all the same architecture of belief. Still, something subtle has shifted over the centuries. The old punishments had witnesses, ours have administrators. The medieval square was loud, messy, emotional. Our justice is bureaucratic, quiet, endlessly documented. We don't cheer anymore, we file. But even silence has its spectators. When a sentence is read or a life is ruined, people still watch. We always watch. The ritual demands it. That's the unsettling truth at the center of all this. Punishment has never been about the condemned. It's about the audience. The medieval crowd gathered not to see pain, but to feel order. To know, deep in their bones, that someone else's suffering meant their world was still intact. We do the same thing today, only we watch it from our phones, our screens, our headlines. It's quieter, but the satisfaction is the same. We say we've abolished cruelty, but that's not quite true. We've just refined it until it's almost invisible. Cruelty no longer shouts. It hums softly beneath the rhythm of our daily lives. It hides in bureaucracy, in data, in the small, polite phrases we use to describe suffering: rehabilitation, correction, deterrence. The words are clean, but the logic is ancient. Every generation swears it's more enlightened than the last. Every generation insists it has built a better, kinder world. And yet, every generation still finds a way to mark the guilty, to separate them from the pure, to prove that pain still keeps us safe. The Middle Ages aren't gone. They're simply better dressed. And maybe that's the final trick history plays on us. That progress doesn't erase the past, it just layers over it. The old bones of the scaffold lie under our streets, under our institutions, under our language. Every law still carries the echo of a sermon. Every verdict still carries a shadow of the whip. We've built modernity on medieval foundations, and the structure holds firm because it still speaks to something in us. The need for order, the need for consequence, the need to know that the universe, however cruel, is at least consistent. There's a kind of poetry in that continuity. The same rope that once tightened around a neck now tightens invisibly around an identity, a reputation, a life. We don't see it happen, but we feel its pull all the same. Civilization may have learned to whisper, but its voice hasn't changed. Perhaps one day it will. Perhaps there will come a time when justice means healing instead of harm, when mercy isn't weakness, when punishment isn't our only form of comfort. But until then, the machinery will keep turning, slow and steady, as it always has. And if you stand very still, in the quiet of some forgotten alleyway where a scaffold once stood, you might hear it, the soft, rhythmic creak of history repeating itself. Not loud, not violent, just steady. The sound of a civilization that still believes, above all things, that to keep the world in order, someone must always pay. It's late in history now, so late that the stars themselves seem to have grown weary of watching us repeat the same story. The torches are long gone, the gallows dust, the iron cold, and yet, somehow, the world still feels suspended in the same faint glow of moral firelight. Every civilization likes to imagine itself as standing at the end of the road, wiser than those who came before. But endings, like punishments, are illusions. What we call progress is often just refinement, the same melody played slower, There's something almost tender about how carefully we've learned to disguise cruelty. The medieval crowd needed spectacle. We need subtlety. They gathered in squares, shoulder to shoulder, bound by the warmth of shared righteousness. We gather in silence, behind glass and screens, still bound by the same emotion, relief. The knowledge that justice, however quietly, is still being done. That feeling, small, solemn, reassuring, is what the Middle Ages perfected. The ritual of pain was not born from sadism, but from necessity. Without it, people felt the world might tilt off its axis. To punish was to steady it. To see punishment was to believe in structure. And even now, centuries later, we still steady ourselves on that belief, even as we claim to reject it. In the modern world, punishment has become invisible but inescapable. The prisons are hidden at the edges of cities. The trials happen behind closed doors. The condemned rarely speak, and when they do, their voices echo faintly through official statements and paperwork. No spectacle, no shouting, no torches. Just silence, the most civilized form of control. The silence, of course, is what makes it so enduring. A system that no longer needs to explain itself can last forever. The medieval world shouted about sin and order because it was afraid the crowd might stop believing. Our world doesn't need to shout. We've built belief into the air itself. Justice is a given, punishment a habit. The rituals continue automatically, as though history has become self-operating. But every so often, a moment breaks through that calm. A wrongful conviction overturned. A system exposed. A sentence questioned. For an instant, we see the machine from the outside, its cogs still greased with old ideas. And we realize with a chill that the structure hasn't aged. It has adapted. The same faith in pain, the same trust in control, the same quiet acceptance that someone must suffer for the rest to feel safe. The truth is, humanity doesn't fear cruelty. It fears chaos. Cruelty, when codified, feels like order. It reassures us that there are still boundaries, still rules, still hands steady enough to decide who deserves what. The Middle Ages may have believed God drew those boundaries. We believe data does. Both faiths demand the same thing, obedience through awe. And maybe that's why the scaffold still haunts us. Not because of what it did, but because of what it meant. It was a simple, brutal metaphor, the body as law, the pain as proof. In its own twisted way, it was honest. The rope, the wheel, the stake, they didn't pretend to be merciful. They didn't hide behind words like rehabilitation or reform. They told the truth of power in its purest form. This is how order survives. We've only refined the delivery. We've made justice look kind, sound reasonable, feel inevitable. But the structure beneath, obedience born from fear, remains untouched. Civilization never replaced the scaffold. It simply internalized it. The gallows moved inward. The ropes became invisible, wrapped around consciences, reputations, and the fragile hope of belonging. That's why the ghosts of those old punishments linger, not in museums, but in us. We carry them quietly like moral relics, shaping how we think about wrongdoing, fairness, forgiveness. Even when we say we want justice, what we really mean is that we want reassurance. We want to see pain balanced with pain, even if we never call it that aloud. It's difficult, almost impossible, to imagine a world without that instinct. What would a society look like if it didn't require someone to suffer in order to function? What would law mean without consequence? What would morality mean without fear? These questions unsettle us precisely because they reveal how much of our identity is built on the logic of punishment. Take that away, and the floor beneath civilization starts to feel a little less solid. And so we cling to it. We keep the ritual, stripped of smoke and blood, hidden under polite phrases and glowing screens. We maintain the hum of authority because silence, true silence, would terrify us. A world without punishment would feel unanchored, too free, too uncertain, too human. That, perhaps, is the legacy of the Middle Ages. Not their cruelty, but their clarity. They understood that pain, when made ritual, could hold back the void. And though we may have changed the instruments, we still play the same refrain. Every sentence, every judgment, every sigh of relief when balance is restored, each is a note in that long, unbroken song of control. Someday, when future generations look back at us, they'll see the same paradox we see in the medievals. They'll shake their heads, half horrified, half sympathetic, and say, they still believed pain could make them pure. They'll see our prisons, our systems, our quiet punishments, and know exactly what they are: cathedrals built not to worship gods, but to worship order itself. And maybe then, when they've dismantled the last of those cathedrals and learned to live without fear disguised as virtue, they'll finally bury the scaffold for good. Until then, the echo remains, steady, familiar, almost comforting, because the world, even now, still loves its rituals. And the oldest one of all is this: the crowd gathers, the judgment falls, and somewhere, deep in the quiet machinery of civilization, a single, unseen rope tightens again.